All right, good evening, everyone, and thank you all for joining us. My name is Scott Britton, and I'm the director here at the Castle Museum in Marietta, Ohio. And we want to thank all of you, especially, we know time is valuable. It was a beautiful day out here in Marietta, and I hope it was wherever you're joining us this evening. And again, thank you for your time. And we have a wonderful program ahead of us with Art and his presentation on the Marietta newspapers. At this point, I want to talk about, for folks that are just joining us that have not done Zoom sessions before, I'll try to keep this as brief as possible. If I can get my, there we go. If I can get my Castle screens up here. For our webinar services, for folks that have not used it before, what we're going to use tonight is the chat and Q&A functions down in the middle of your screen. There will be some issues with the chat if you have any particular issues. Okay. Okay. If you have any particular connection issues, please let us know through the chat feature. The Q&A feature down in the bottom center there will be for putting questions in. You can do that at any particular time throughout the presentation. And again, Art will take those questions at the very end. And of course, the exit function there. Before we get started, I want to give a few announcements of some of the programs that we have coming up and give you the opportunity to visit our website at mariettacastle.org to find out all the different details of that. We ask that you consider, if you're a local, to come and join us and volunteer with all the different programs that we do as either a tour guide, a docent, as we call them, do a variety of different educational programs. We have landscaping opportunities, virtual experiences, something for everyone. Some of the programs that we have coming up on July the 3rd, just before Independence Day, on Saturday the 3rd at 10 a.m. and a second tour at 12 will be at Mound Cemetery, and it will be talking about the Patriots buried there from the American Revolution and some of our founding fathers here in Marietta. To give you an update on our virtual history camp this year, we're doing Reconstructing America from 1880 to 1900. It's a virtual camp again this year, July 5th through the 9th, and we'll have a series of different programs and instructors throughout that. You can see the costs, and again, for more details of the individual programs, you can visit our website, again, mariettacastle.org, for further details, and we have extended the signups for those. So tell your friends and neighbors and some of your family members. We also have Archaeology Camp opportunities. The first one, July the 12th through the 15th, starting at 9 a.m. Wes Clark, our professional archaeologist that we have here on staff at the Castle, will be leading students in grades 6 through 8 through an actual archaeology dig here on the property, one of the earliest pottery sites in the state of Ohio. So learn some of those techniques and some of the interesting history and help us to discover our own past here at the Castle. And then we have an opportunity again for adults and high school students on July the 26th through the 29th. Again, Wes is going to be leading that group. We've received a number of volunteers throughout that. If you've ever wanted to see how that works, please join us, and it's a wonderful opportunity to participate in history. So without further ado, again, we'll be adding some of those, Lori Smith, Art's wife, will be adding some of those links to go directly to some of those programs, and we'll have some other things after the program. But we're going to have a Q&A, again, following the program. But I want to introduce our speaker for this evening, Art Smith, who has joined us before here virtually. And he's the webmaster of the Parkersburg News and Sentinel, as well as the Marietta Times. He's a longtime supporter. His wife Lori is one of our moderators here this evening, is one of our board members, and it's great to have him back again for another program here to talk about our local newspaper history. Again, feel free to add your questions in the Q&A session. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Art.
Well, thank you, Scott. As Scott said, my name is Art Smith, and give you a little background on myself. I've been with the Times since 1977, part-time for 6 years, full-time for the last 38 years. And I've been a photographer and designer and book editor and a bunch of different things. Today, I'm going to talk about the kind of the history, mainly the history through the front page, and kind of share some background stories on some of the pages and show you some examples and kind of explain the technology that we used over the years. So let's get right into it. And okay, so what you're looking at is the original nameplate from the first edition of the Marietta Times, and this would be September 24th, 1864. So this would have been around 40,000 editions ago, some 500,000 pages from the newspaper that we print today. We've been daily since 1898. So 123 years we've been a daily newspaper, printing 6 days a week. So here's the first edition. This is volume 1, number 1. And what you'll notice is the paper is very gray. And I'll explain why as we work our way through. You know, cities, even the size of Marietta, once had a lot of newspapers. In a minute, we'll see how many Marietta actually had. And a lot of them existed to spread one political voice or another. And if you read this first edition of the Marietta Times, you can tell they didn't really care for President Lincoln. It talks about Jackson and Lincoln. It said Jackson has great force of character, Lincoln has none. Jackson was lean and a great man. Lincoln is a lean and a small one. And it goes on to just talk about, you know, Lincoln's jokes were vulgar and tell to the damage of the nation. So not very flattering of the president. So I set off on a project a number of years ago to capture front pages. And to do that, you really need to use microfilm. And as consumers of antique news, you have a couple of choices in Marietta. You have the Department of Special Collections at the Legacy Library at Marietta College, and you have the Washington County Public Library. They both have the complete editions of the Times. So all the examples you'll see, nearly all the examples, are off microfilm. So even pages that we may have printed in color, you're going to see them in black and white tonight. So this is September 24th, 1864. Not even a year later, we find that the president's been shot. And of course, that occurred on April 15th, 1865. The Marietta Times was a weekly at that point, and would be until 1898. And you know, when I was working on this project, I set forth to find this, and I was kind of shocked. This is the front page of the Marietta Times. The story you see on the right is actually on page 2, and it reads like a chilling news story that it was. This would have been printed 5 days after the assassination, but it reads like it's that night. This evening at 9:30 p.m. at the Forest Theater, the president, while sitting in his private box with Mrs. Lincoln, Mrs. Harris, and Major Rathburn, was shot by an assassin who suddenly entered the box and approaching from behind the president. The assassin then leaped from the stage, brandishing a large dagger or knife, and made it escape to the rear of the theater. We now know that this, of course, was John Wilkes Booth, and we know this to be a fairly accurate account of what happened. I want everyone to notice a couple of things unique about this page. Notice the black bars between the pages. The way pages were built, there would normally be a brass bar that wasn't as high as the letters, and to get that to print like that, they would have had that to be a little bit higher. Talking to a historian earlier in the week, this was a fairly common thing that would have been done on newspapers of the day, but it really creates a unique look. You know, if you look at the edition from 6 months before, you just see a black line, very thin black line, the assassination newspaper. So reported as news 5 days after the event and on page 2. So now, one thing I did with the project was I tried to capture each decade, a complete newspaper from each decade. So this is the beginning of the 1870s. And we see a paper that is very gray still. You have some small artwork, you have some variation in type size, but mainly you're looking at a very gray newspaper. And when we get to 1900, I'll kind of break out and kind of show you why. This is from the Library of Congress. These are all the newspapers that were being printed in Marietta in the 1800s. Some of these are duplicates. They all don't overlap. You know, you have the Marietta Friend from 1813 to 1823. I know that's available on microfilm. I know at the Ohio University Library, but 1813, that would have been, you know, just a few decades after Marietta got started. You have a German-speaking newspaper. You have a lot of newspapers that are being printed. And if you get a hold of a copy of these, they were printed on better paper than was used later in that century and since then. So they actually hold together quite well. Okay, so this will be 1880. You notice the nameplate switches from Old English to a different font. You know, we've used Old English the whole time I've worked for the Times, and you kind of assume in your head it went all the way back. But as you look at historical newspapers, you see they kind of experimented through the years. 1890, 1900. So I wanted to kind of explain a little bit about how this would have been put together. So let me quit sharing my screen for a second and kind of show you a couple things. So in that early time, each letter would be a separate file. And when I say each letter, all these would have to be put together one by one. And that would be a very tedious task. Remember, you're working backwards and you're putting elements together. You have things like your nameplate that is actually attached to lead. This weighs about a pound and would have been put together with the rest of the nameplate in the right order. And that would have been a very time and tedious process to put together. Just bear with me for a second here. So around 1888, they invented a device called a linotype machine, which a newspaper the size of the Times would have had about 4 or 5 of these. And it made it a little bit easier to set the type. You had to type it, the type would have came out backwards, but entire lines would be together. And that would have allowed you to build a page that looked like this. This is actually the last edition of the Parkersburg News that they printed on this method. This would have been the 1970s. So they would have used this for about 80 years. So that's the front of it, the business side of it. that is the backside of it, where all this type is held together. There's actually bolts. If you take them out, the whole page would fall apart. So what they would then is they would take that and they would make a cast of it. If you look at this, there's actually depth to that. And from that, they would make a curved plate, because presses are rotary presses. You don't print newspapers on a flat press. So you have to turn this flat object into a curve. And that is what would go on your press. So you have all these generations, all these time-consuming generations to get all this, so you can print it. So your time spans between when you could write the story and print it were quite a bit. So for the last 50 years, we worked on shortening those by eliminating generations. So let's go back to 1900 and look at this page. So this page, compared to a modern page, you see it's a lot different. The modern page is thinner. The depth is always the same. Any newspaper you see, the depth is always going to be the same, because that's the diameter of your press. So 21.5 inches would be how long your paper is. But you look at the page and it's just a different theory of how much content you put on there. Each piece of content, designers would call it a point of entry. And it could be a promo saying, look on page B1, or it could be an actual headline or a breakout box, whatever. And 1900, this page has 67. The modern one has 31. So, but the cost of that is a paper that is so gray that it's difficult to read. So let's look at some of these stories. So if we look on the left side, I'm going to read the ones with the dots next to them. SB and AJ Longfellow had returned from Tate Springs, Tennessee, where they spent 2 weeks. Frank Shaw and his wife went to Dayton today to spend a week or 10 days with friends and relatives. Clarence, the 6-year-old son of Mr. Joseph Gregory of Upper 3rd Street, died last night at 11:30 o'clock, a whooping cough and other troubles. So what does this sound like to us? It sounds a lot like what you see posted on social media. So, you know, what you have on the right is my Twitter feed. If you consume much social media, you notice a lot of trivial things. And in fact, the newspaper in 1900 was filled with some very personal type information, because it was really the only media that people could consume stuff on. You know, you didn't have TV, you didn't have computers, you didn't have social media, you really didn't have a radio, you didn't have a lot of the things that we kind of take for granted. Newspapers was really your main way to digest anything. So you saw a lot of very short items listed in the paper. So, you know, the Times has been around to cover virtually every big story that's happened in our community for generations and generations. You know, the biggest story, if you talk to people that have lived here for a long time, the 1913 flood. Great flood coming down the Muskingum Valley, disaster among cities, Ohio is still growing. And it lists bulletins. Dayton, from 500 to 10,000 dead. You got to remember, a newspaper is accurate when it's printed, but history frequently corrects itself. There weren't 10,000 people killed in Dayton. The number was around 370. And you read down through these, and it's very interesting how that story was reported. Someplace on this page, it says, you know, the Times will continue printing. Reality, it was 12 days later, that they printed again. The next biggest flood occurred in 1937. In parts of Ohio, that flood was actually larger than the flood of 1913. These are interesting front pages because they're 4 days apart. Cold checks flood, 39 feet predicted. That's what they thought on January 19th. 4 days later, 50-foot crest expected. That's 11 feet difference. You guys are sitting in your house right now, look at your ceiling, it's 8 feet off your floor, add 3 feet, and that's how far off they were in predicting how deep the flood was going to be. So, you know, the 37 flood was so devastating. That's when Parkersburg decided to build a wall around the town. And, you know, Marietta didn't. And we've survived through another couple dozen floods. Another flood that we seem to have trouble predicting the crest on happened in recent time. 2004, we had a flood that caught a lot of people off guard because it crested higher than we thought. Downtown businesses were caught trying to scramble at the last minute to get merchandise out. The coverage between 37 and 2004, of course, is quite a bit different. Those photos would have been printed in color. The inside pages were color as well. You know, if we look at the index over there, Times devoted probably 4 or 5 pages to the flood with a lot of information about businesses, relief, where to volunteer, a lot of consumer information. So I know many of you probably volunteered to help clean up the mess that resulted from that flood. But it's interesting to see the same story covered in different times by different people, but really in the same newspaper. I've always been intrigued by presidential visits and near presidential visits. You know, when Teddy Roosevelt came to Marietta, he wasn't president. He had been president. He was running for president again. And so you have the story. This is 1912. He spoke in Muskingum Park. There's photos of him speaking in Muskingum Park, but there's not photos in the Times of him speaking in Muskingum Park. To get photos in the paper was a very time-consuming process that couldn't be done on deadline. So you see a lot of use of what we would call today canned art, or art that they could process beforehand, and it illustrated the page. At this time, the Times would have went to press probably 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I'm not sure what time he spoke. There probably wasn't time to do the chemical etching of metal to make a current photo that would be used in the paper. Charles Dawes got nominated for vice president. Of course, that happened at the convention in Cleveland, but he was in Marietta when he got in the news. His childhood home on 4th Street, just a few doors down from where St. Mary's is, a block from the castle. He got the news and talked to some reporters and went back in his house about 11 o'clock and went to bed. So this is an extra that the Times printed. And extra is a newspaper that you print off your normal cycle. So they don't happen very often. It's an additional newspaper for that day. So we printed one in 2001, which we'll see here in a few minutes, but it was a big deal. You know, he went on to be vice president. This one's intrigued me. 100,000 hear Roosevelt speak. Franklin Roosevelt came to Marietta to dedicate the Augustine Borland monument to the westward movement that's in Muskingum Park. He also dedicated the 4 pylons that mark the end of the park. The Marietta Times reported 100,000 people hear Roosevelt speak. Now, he spoke near where the monument is, and photos exist of him speaking. You see a lot of open space around him. The press were seated at tables. And so, you know, you envision people filling Muskegon Park. Muskegon Park's 4/10 of a mile long, so you figure 3/10 of a mile. I'm not sure you can get 100,000 people in that space. And, for some reason, Times gave that number, and the population of Washington County was probably half of that at that point. So all of Washington, all of Wood, Morgan, Monroe, all those people that came from Marietta, it was likely quite a bit smaller than that. It's interesting if you read the story. It was a very hot day. 12 people got overcome by the heat. The funeral home ran the ambulance service at that time. They simply took the people, gave them a glass of water, took them home. There's nobody transported to the hospital. They just took the people home. So this is the first page we've looked at that I was actually present for. This is Ronald Reagan visiting in 1980. This was a couple days before he was elected president. And this is a photo shot by Tim Elliott and Van Johnson Fieldhouse. I wanted to kind of explain the struggle that something like this created in 1980. So that was a color photograph. To run that in color the next day in the newspaper, we had to charter a small plane to fly to one of our sister newspapers in Pennsylvania to have color separations made. And color separations are simply taking a photo and making 4 black and white prints of it, one that you use blue ink on, one that you use yellow ink on, one that you use red ink on, and one that you use black ink on. But if you don't have the equipment to do it with, you have to go someplace that does. And in 1980, that meant us going to Pennsylvania. That's the only photo we ran in color from that event because of the amount of time it took. You fast forward to 1988, and George H.W. Bush came to Marietta, actually rode across the Ohio River in the Valley Gym, and we, at that point, had the mechanics to make our own color separations, but they still took an hour and a half per photo. So I think we ran a photo page inside that would have had 6 or 7 photos. So you're looking at about 10 hours of processing just to run 10 photos in the paper. Now it's nearly instant. You place them on a page, you output them, and it takes 4 minutes for the plate to be made. So 1993, Hillary Clinton came to explain Bill Clinton's healthcare plan, and some photographer who I will not name thought it'd be a good idea to run a double photo page. And the process took a little bit longer per photo. And we ended up, it was a Friday, we should have started the press at 1:30 in the morning. We started at 4 a.m., much to the disdain of the carriers that were waiting on it. But you always push the envelope. You always see how far you can go to maximize your story. And we probably went a little bit too far in that one. So her husband came back in 2008, campaign for him. By that time, we're fully paginated, which means you can have 50 photos on that page, and it's still going to take 4 minutes to send it out. So technology over these years have greatly enhanced our ability to use color photography and color elements, color maps in the newspaper. I can remember in the 80s doing color charts for the newspaper on a Macintosh Plus, which, you know, the little ones with a 9-inch black and white screen. So you haven't lived until you've done color graphics on a black and white computer. So, you know, technology allows us to do a lot of things a lot more efficiently than we used to be able to. So I kind of wanted to run through some pages. This is January 1st, 1999, when first female governor of Ohio took office, when Nancy Hollister was sworn in. She wasn't the first governor for Marietta, of course. Marietta Bill O'Neill became Ohio's 59th governor in 1957. So you just kind of see how the coverage changes. You know, we devoted half the front page and a whole inside page to Nancy Hollister, where Bill O'Neill, we kind of used just part of the front page. I really don't think they probably didn't do a photo page of it. That just wasn't in the thought process at that time. Newspapers cover the good and the bad. We cover what happens in a community, and that's universal for the Times and any other newspaper. We should be a reflection of what happens in a town. We try to hit that mark. We don't always hit the mark as well as we could, but for since 1864, we've been covering things for the citizens of Marietta and the Middle Ohio Valley. So this is the premiere of Battle Hymn, which is the movie based on a story about a veteran in Korea that helped save children in an orphanage. It was a huge deal for Marietta, and it premiered simultaneously at all 5 theaters in Marietta. Let me say that again, all 5 theaters in Marietta. And they had a parade, Rock Hudson came, and the story was written by, if you look at this, by Ted Bauer. Ted Bauer went on to be city editor of the Times, retired about 30 years ago, and is still plays golf, and you see him on the street, and he's a great guy. He's in his late 90s now, but he covered that story, which is pretty cool. I put these two up for comparison. $40,000 blaze sweep to 2nd Street District. This is about between Zides and Tampico's, I believe, where this Union, I think it was Union Hardware. And there's a photographer named Fisher that captures some incredible photos of this. I don't know why there aren't any in the Times. It was just an incredible fire, and it would have been a block from the office. It kind of baffles me a little bit why they didn't cover these stories photographically. As a photographer, that's always kind of bothered me. On the right side is fire levels, Swan Lumber. You're at Pioneer Park, and you look out in center field, just beyond the fence where Swan Lumber was. This is in 1993. Fire got so hot, it melted the lights on the fire department's brand new ladder truck that they had. So, 2 fires, 2 businesses, one in 32, one in 93. So you kind of see how the coverage changes. This is the beginning of World War I. And that in itself makes this kind of an interesting front page to look at. But the story on the right side, 2 men lost when Tell City goes down. Tell City was a stern wheeler, and it was maneuvering through some locks that were around Little Hocking at the time. The Ohio River used to have a lot more locks and dams than it has now. And it hit a snag and it sunk, and people drowned. And the boat parts of the boat were salvaged, and the pilot house was used by people as like a little cabin in their yard in Little Hocking until they donated it to the Ohio River Museum, who further restored it. And now it sits about 50 feet from the river trail next to the W.P. Snyder. So the photo on the right, which I shot a week ago, directly ties to this front page from April 6, 1917. So, a lot of our history that we see around town, you can tie back to a front page that was in the Marietta Times. I just wanted to show you guys some pages that kind of send a chill up your spine when you look at them. This is the coverage of the attack on Pearl Harbor, December 8th, 1941. Remember, it occurred on a Sunday morning, and the Times prints 6 days a week. It doesn't print on Sunday. They may have printed an extra that day. I don't know. This is the coverage of D-Day, the landing on the beaches of Normandy. We, meaning the U.S. and other countries, worked to push Hitler back across Europe. May 8th, 1945, victory, Germany defeated, Japan comes next. And September 1st, 1945, the actual end of the war. So, you know, when I was working on this project for historical front pages, I had a different front page for each day of the calendar. And whenever I hit a date that I couldn't find a big story for, I would go to 1945, because every day was an incredible story. So, you know, of all news years in the last century, 1944, 1945 had to be an incredible time to be a journalist. So, September 11th, 2001. Give you a little personal story here. I work in Parkersburg now. My first day in Parkersburg was September 10th, 2001. So I went down the day before, you know, moved my computer and everything. The next day, the terrorists attacked our nation, and I went back to Marietta, helped lay out this page and other pages, while the rest of the country were glued to their TV sets. I was glued to my computer monitor, doing things, you know, on these pages. I never saw it all day. I heard it. The TV was behind me. I would occasionally turn around, but the day-long story that most of America experienced, I had a whole different experience. So I wanted to put up some stories that most people will remember or around. March 5th, 1984. That was a month before I started working full time. So I was working part time, but I wasn't primary shooter until a month later. So the Becky Thatcher sinks, and eventually, and people that were around know what I say by eventually, they picked the boat up and got it to down around Portsmouth and got it in dry dock. And I went down there when it was in dry dock to do a photo story on it. And this repairman said, "Hey, I want to show you something." And he sticks his finger through the hull of the boat. I said, "You guys put a new hull on it. How long will it last?" He said, "It will last around 30 years. And 30 years later, the Becky Thatcher sunk for good, and the whole top of it kind of collapsed, and it's history. But it was weird that he said that, and then 30 years later, it came true. Page on the right is the old Putnam Street Bridge, the 1913 Putnam Street Bridge, being exploded off the piers so that they could finish building the Putnam Bridge, which took its place. You know, you see a robust use of photos, very large, and that was a color photo that was really helped carry that page. Very sad story, February 9th, 1981. Lieutenant Ray Clark got killed in his home. Some of the staff people at the Times were very close to them. And in fact, Tim Elliott, who I believe his wife wrote one of the stories on the page, he called, they didn't know who gotten killed. They called Ray Clark's house to try to get information from him, not knowing he in fact had been the one that got shot. You know, this story only ended a couple years ago when a person was finally charged and found guilty in prison. So the page on the right, the Harmer House fire, which has gone through some renovations and name changes, and is now Waterview facility on Harmer Hill, was a devastating fire that killed 21 nursing home residents, mainly because of smoke created by carpet that ended up changing the regulations on carpet nationwide. So from this very bad story came a change in how carpet was regulated. March 15th, 1993, major blizzard hit the area. That is 3 weeks after we moved into our house. And I was snowed in by a 5-foot drift across my driveway. I thought, oh my God, we built our house in the wrong spot. This is going to happen all the time. The photo at the bottom of the snowplow, that is coming up my road. That's as far as I could get. So that's the only photo I contributed to that story, because I literally couldn't get out of my driveway. So April 7th, 1938, you have the pioneers landing again in Marietta when a bunch of college students reenacted the original journey of the 48 pioneers from 1788. Okay, so I want to just kind of go through these. These are the front pages from each decade. So 1870, 1880, 1890, 1900, 1910, 1920, 1930, 1940. So you see some changes in the way the nameplate is presented. The word daily kind of pops in and out. The word the kind of pops in and out. We continue, we got 1950, 1960, 1970. If you look at the 1970 paper, that is when the Times moved from Putnam Street, where it was printed with the type of printing that I showed you, to Channel Lane, where it migrated to what's called cold type, which is a photo. There's actually a film strip in it that would set the type. So you notice a big font change, and the overall appearance of the paper changed, just because the process that was used to produce it changed. So we have 1970, 1980, 1990, 2000, and 2020. For some reason I was 2010 there, but it's just interesting to kind of see the migration of how the presentation would have changed over the years. Okay, I would like to open it up for questions. And I think Lori's going to chime in here.
Yes, I'll be watching the chat. And if you have any questions, just type them in and I'll make sure that Art knows what the questions are.
I'll go ahead and get us started off while folks are taking the time to put some questions in there, Art. What did they do with the curved pieces that were produced every day when they did that printing process? Were they recycled, or were they kind of a one and done type of option?
Yeah, so the flat part, the things like this would have been saved, but the stories would have been those would have been made out of lead, and a lot of linotype operators actually suffered from lead poisoning and ended up going deaf. So you had a lot of deaf linotype operators. The curved part, which weighs significantly less. The big flat page weighs about 92 pounds. I can't carry it. I have one in my office, and I always make someone else carry it. It just weighs too much to move around. The curved part, though, is made out of some type of alloy that melts at a lower temperature. So those were constantly reused. So we have 4 of them in Parkersburg, all from the last day. On the last day, they and there's no ink on them, so they must have just created them just to so that someone 50 years later could could show it at a castle presentation. I have one of those in my office too, but it's a lot lighter. You can carry it around. And there would have been two of them. They would have went on the cylinder of the press like a clamshell. So the press would have been a single wide. We print 2 pages next to one another now. Those presses would have been thinner, would have had more cylinders on it than we have now. So we print more pages per cylinder than they could have done. The presses last a very long time. A press will last 50, 60, 70 years.
All right.
Okay,
Thanks, Art.
Art, we have a question. We have a few questions here, but the first one is, how long does it now take to prepare the paper for printing?
Well, the short answer is 24 hours because we print one every day. You know, some wise man once called it or maybe it was a wise woman once called it the daily miracle. And so, you know, pages for tomorrow are started this morning, and the last page would be done. That would be the front of sports, and the front page of the paper normally would be done like 10 o'clock at night. Times is actually printed at 2 in the morning. We print the news and we immediately print the Times and the sequence that we do. Early in the pandemic, we moved everything up really early because there wasn't anything going on, and we wanted to just be able to get people off the roads earlier. But we're back to the news prints at 12:30 and Times prints at 2. And then they're distributed, you know, the next morning. But actual page, let's say you had a story worthy of the front page happen at 10 o'clock. You'd come back, you'd write the story. We use Adobe InDesign to produce our pages. So as quick as you can get that story written, you can get on the page. The photo, you know, as quick as you can get it sized and placed on the page, it would be there. We output a PDF. PDF is ran through a process that mates the page that gets printed with it. So like page 1 and page 8 of an 8-page section go on the same file. And then it's a process is called direct to plate. There's no negative. It goes from PDF to the plate. Imagine a printer that prints onto a sheet of metal. And that's what we do. And that takes about 4 minutes. And then that plate immediately goes on the press. So the whole process, if you're waiting on the process as you go through, probably 15 minutes between when you shot the photo of the building burning and you get it on the press, maybe 25 before you get good copies. It's pretty quick.
Okay, Art, we have a couple questions about type. One is how long did it take to set the type for just one page back when each letter had to be placed separately?
Well, put all these in the proper order. I don't know, it'd take a while. What I've always heard, and it could be, you know, journalism legend, is, you know, the term upper and lowercase letters, that comes from the type cases, which anybody who knows me would not be surprised. We have those hanging on our wall on, I think, every floor of our house. But you would have a place for A's and a place for B. You would grab them, you put them together. But I imagine people got very quick at it, like anything else. But I would think it would take forever. You know, the letters have a groove on them, so when you get them all together, you can kind of lock them in. But it's very tedious. And remember, you're doing it backwards. You're doing a mirror image, so you not only have to get them in the right order, you have to do it backwards, and then you have to make sure you get one line down. You got to lock it in. You put the next one in, and you know, so a story, you know, may have 1,500 separate pieces of little tiny type. then when you get all done, you take the page apart and you'd have to sort them back in the right drawers. It would take forever. So, you know, it used to be a very labor intensive operation just to get the type on the paper. I heard the News and Sentinel had 12 linotype operators. That's a huge number of people be sitting there in these very hot. Think about it, this hot, there's molded lead in these machines, so it had to be incredibly laborious. And you know, I was up a weekly in Caldwell. This is 10 years ago, and I walked in and there's a linotype machine sitting there. I said, "Oh my God, I've never seen one of those outside of a museum." Wrong thing to say. I said, "When was the last time that was used?" And this guy kind of looked at his shoes and he said, "Yesterday." So they still used it to make like road signs with, you know, very low run signage, like for the county. They had a few things that it made sense to use it with, so they still use it. Last time I was up there, they don't use it anymore. But things are massive. They're like, "Hey, do you want it?" I'm like, "No, I don't think my wife would like that in her entryway very much." So I didn't bring it home with me.
All right, Art, the other question about type, we have a person that's attending today that worked in the newspaper industries in the 1970s. And she said they had two departments, the hot type and the other one cold type. Do you know what the difference is?
Yeah, so hot type would be the lead, the linotype, and the cold type would be the pasting up with you know, flat artwork. You know, you think of this stuff being raised like that. You can see the raise to it. Cold type would be basically, you know, clip art. It's printed on papers and you cut it up, and they would have had to then photograph that and etch it. There was this interim period, which you know, because of the life of presses, where you would, instead of doing the hot lead, you would create a plastic plate that had raised letters on it. That was problematic because the like the dots of a photo, the more you printed, the dots would actually like fall off, and your photos would look and your like the dot on an eye would literally fall off the plate. It would just wear off. So you see that. I think we're about at the end of that. Those presses would have been presses that were put into service 80 years ago, and because of consolidation of printing, I doubt. I haven't heard of anybody still using those, because you know, you have some newspapers like the Indianapolis Star. You know, they probably print 15 newspapers a night. So you know, because of that, I doubt that's occurring any place really. I don't know of anybody who's still using hot lead in the U.S. I'm sure there could be some isolated weekly that may still be using it because it works for them.
All right, we have someone asking whether the Marietta Times has full-time employees and photographers, and do some or most or all the staff work from home or from the Marietta Times office?
Yeah, so we have a building in Marietta, which has been there since 1969, 700 Channel Lane. And, you know, the beginning of the pandemic, we kind of had a lot of people work from home. You know, it's very important that we didn't get sick. And then we kind of migrated back to the office because we had so few people working in the Marietta office. We brought them down to Parkersburg. You know, it's no secret we would like to sell that building. It's 22,000 square feet. We needed about 2,000 square feet. So because, you know, we've not printed in that building since 2002. So there's different consolidations that have occurred. We do have employees. The employees kind of split their time between working from home and working out of our Parkersburg office. We have several reporters, sports people, a clerk. You know, at work today, there's a couple of them in there. They have desks in Parkersburg. And, we do use the Marietta Times. We had a spelling bee contestant, Marietta Times spelling bee, which was virtual this year. The young man qualified for a couple rounds, and we did that from the Marietta Times office.
Art, we had somebody ask that when might we see the older newspapers fully digitalized and searchable?
That's a great question. So, you know, the Marietta Times is part of the Ogden newspaper company now. And we actually looked into this a couple years ago. Me and the technology director, we went to our location in Altoona, Pennsylvania, meet with this representative from a company that makes a microfilm scanner that scans at basically the idle speed of microfilm, where you can still kind of see the pages go by, but you wouldn't be able to read them. And we calculated that it would take 3.5 years using 18 computers running 24/7 to scan the 6 million newspaper pages that we think we have on hand. And, you know, digitized newspaper doesn't do you any good unless you run OCR software on it that extrapolates out the text, because you have to be able to search it. And if you go and you look at those, you know, for instance, the President Lincoln paper, you really got to kind of mentally think about what letter that probably is to read it. And the earlier the microfilm, the harder it is to read, because the technology to make the microfilm wasn't very good in 1900 when they microfilmed that 40-year-old newspaper. So I don't know. There's been a couple of projects. Google had a project where they set out to digitize all written knowledge, and they stopped. And you know, they had talked about digitizing all newspapers. They actually started it, and then they stopped. So the real issue is who pays for it? Who pays for the massive amount of work to do it? How is it accessible? And how is it how's it searchable? You know, the Library of Congress has undertaken some projects. You know, obviously the copyright on a lot of newspapers has expired. We would never be opposed. I wouldn't think any newspaper would digitizing it. Some newspapers, like the New York Times, they've bit the bullet and digitized the whole newspaper. And you can read that story from 1912. You're going to have to pay a little bit to read it, which I don't think is a problem. But you know, it's an economy of scale. New York Times has a lot more digital readers than we do, and but not all that many more pages. Maybe twice or three times the number of pages, but 50 times the resources and potential people to look at it. But it's all available for free if you want to go to the library, find the date. And I want to warn you of something. Things that we consider important now, not so much when they happen. Like, don't go to try to find the Wright brothers flying at Kitty Hawk in the Marietta Times in 1903, because you won't find it, because they didn't even believe they did it for months afterwards. So, you know, stuff that we consider important now is not necessarily considered important when they happen. So keep that in mind as you go looking for that really cool story that happened decades ago. And be ready to find surprises. 1913 flood didn't kill anybody in Marietta, but killed 7 people that were trying to repair the Beverly Dam. So you're scrolling through pages and you see a headline saying 7 drowned in the Muskingum River. You're like, what the heck? And you know, sometimes you just happen across a story that you really didn't have any knowledge of until you see this blaring headline on the top of the page. I looked at about 500 front pages to do that series, and it's kind of cool to do. And I hope to do something else with that project at some point.
All right, Art. We just have time for one more question.
Okay.
One quick answer, I guess, if you can.
Ooh,
When did it become popular to have paid ads in newspapers? Or did businesses always have some kind of presence in newspapers?
But when you look back in those papers from the 1800s, and they had ads in them, they were, you know, very much like a classified looking ad we'd see today. But you know, they advertised for dry goods, and you know, by 1900, 1910, you know, you had full blown display ads, and you know, the 1930s and 1940s, 1950s were really the heyday of end paper advertising, and you'd see grocery ads that would take up 2 or 3 pages, and you know, the bulk of advertising in the middle of the last century was directly in the newspaper. The pre-print advertising hadn't really happened yet, because at large chain stores hadn't really happened yet to any degree. So.
Okay, and one thing I know is that advertising even can be traced back to colonial newspapers. They even say that Benjamin Franklin and the Pennsylvania Gazette, you know, first used advertising in the 1700s. So thank you very much. That's all the time we have for questions, and then I'll turn it back over to Scott.
All right, thank you very much, Art. That's always fascinating to look at some of those things. Oops, minimize here. Again, thank you all for taking the time out this evening. We know there's lots of different opportunities to do a lot of different things, and we appreciate you spending your time with us. Lori's going to put some things into the chat box, some links there. But we just wanted to give you a heads up. We now have our own YouTube page. So if you search for the Castle Historic House Museum, we would appreciate you going there and subscribing to that to see some of the content that we've had in the past virtual programs, and some of the offerings that we've done there. And again, you can always check out our webpage, mariattacastle.org as well. And I'll finish with, oops, having problems with my screen there. We always appreciate the support that the community has given us, especially in the times of COVID. We really appreciate everything that the community has done to support both these virtual programs. I'll make an announcement tonight. We're going to do our next Third Thursday program is going to be virtual and also in person. So it's going to be one of those hybrid things. And we've had so many people that have supported us really from around the country and a few from around the world that we're going to continue that virtual option for folks in the future. So we thank you for that support. If you want to give us a donation for the great program that we had here tonight or for future programs, we certainly always appreciate that opportunity. And another way that you can always support us is with becoming a member of the Castle. There's some different perks that you get with that, able to do free tours and some passes to some of the other programs that we offer throughout the year. But again, we want to thank everyone for their support. We want to thank everyone for showing up this evening, and we'll hope to see you again in a future program very, very soon. Thank you very much.